Is Juju? Okay, now you can hear me. Hi everyone, good afternoon. Oh, they don't do call and response here, do they? Should we try again? Hi everyone, good afternoon. Oh, there is life. Very good. My name is Eliza Anyangwe. I am the managing editor of CNN as Equals, which is CNN's gender desk. Our work is to report on the systemic causes of gender inequality, as well as look at what it looks like, particularly in the global south, for communities and societies to try and live as equals, which of course includes all the different aspects of living and dying with dignity. So the idea is that patriarchy is a system like any other, and that journalists are particularly bad at reporting on patriarchy as a system that organizes our lives, and that there are winners and losers of patriarchal systems, and that public interest journalism deserves to take that seriously, and so investigate, humanize, reveal, explain. And so that's what our work is, and it has been a huge privilege to be able to host this conversation along with the fantastic speakers you have here. I will introduce them to you, but you will notice that on the end, we have an additional person who is really an essential part of making this possible. Gabriela Ramirez, who is with Hostwriter, is joining us to translate for Luciana Peker, because of course, as we all know, international events are never really international because of visa restrictions and language barriers, and it is a huge privilege that we are able to have a formidable Argentine thinker and journalist, and then of course to have Gabriela as her live translator. So thank you, Gabriela. Yes, please give them a round of applause. Okay, I guess it's my role as the moderator of this conversation to just set the scene a little bit. Before I do that, we have a few copies here, but As Equals has just published a zine of our work. Well, it is an introduction to the work that we have been doing over the last 3 years, as well as tips for people who are interested in doing more impactful reporting, whether it's on gender or other subjects. We share tips and tricks from our collaborators and our team. You can access the PDF there, but you can also pick up physical copies today and in the session that we are hosting tomorrow on extractive journalism. So why have you come? You've come to listen to a session that was titled What Every Journalist Needs to Know About the Connection Between Gender and Rising Authoritarianism Around the World. If you follow the subject, you will know that some platforms like Open Democracy have been covering what they've been calling reporting the backlash for a while now, but it is really a subject outside of mainstream media coverage, at least in a consistent, rigorous way. You might find a story about how Georgia Maloney says, you know, you won't have mothers and fathers anymore, just parent one and parent two. You will have such headlines, and you might see headlines about abortion access being lost in the States, but the kind of connection between these different things and the ways in which they play into political systems and are not just sort of random ad hoc, you know, bog standard misogyny or sexism is what this panel is intended to look at today, to help uncover what is happening and to help people interested in reporting on it understand how they might connect those dots for their own audiences. So we are going to be broad. There are 3 continents covered here. We won't be able to talk about everything. But at the same time, our speakers are going to also try and give you a sense of how it has worked or not worked to cover these subjects and what the human implications of doing so are, because these are not sort of like theoretic topics, but real life implications. Who are our speakers? For this, I will need my laptop because I had to pull all your fantastic bios into one place. Please don't judge my very poor PowerPoint. Is this PowerPoint? Yes, PowerPoint skills. So I will introduce them as you see them in the picture. To my immediate left, Leta Hong Fincher is a research associate at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University. She's the author of 2 books, Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China, which just had its 10th anniversary reissue last year, and the author of a second book, Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China. Both have received numerous accolades. Stephanie Musho, hi Steph, is a human rights lawyer from Kenya, an Aspen New Voices Senior Fellow, and the host of a six-part series called The New Cold War that investigates and exposes illegal and unethical tactics the opposition, I can't wait for you to say who the opposition is, but the opposition uses to negate sexual and reproductive health and rights in Kenya and beyond. Welcome, Steph. And last, I've already sort of touched on who she is. Bienvenida. Luciana Peker is a noted Argentine feminist journalist and the author of many books, including Putita Golosa, for a feminism of enjoyment, Sex de Ame, which is about love and sex in the era of desiring women. In January of this year, she wrote a column for The Guardian in which she laid out how women's rights are disappearing in Argentina, and after Javier Milei's election as president, about the threats to her own personal safety that forced her into exile, saying, "I fear for the rise of anti-feminist extremism." So we're gonna get at some of that today. Please do welcome our panelists. Wonderful. This is again by way of context. For International Women's Day this year, as Equals set out to profile 30 women's rights, excuse me, and LGBTQ rights defenders, again specifically in the context of backlash against these rights and the ways in which they are lost in very specific ways around the world. So I do encourage you to check that out. There's also an explainer because, of course, these things are not within our sort of public narratives about how politics is playing out in our country. So it was incumbent upon us to also produce an explainer that basically says what the anti-gender movement is. And you will hear our speakers speak to that too. I'm not going to actually bother reading that, but what I do want to do is quote Hungarian historian Andrea Petu in trying to distinguish what was happening now from, other, rejections of women's rights, situating it specifically in the context of the crisis on democracy and the rise of far-right populism. She says, "The anti-gender movement is not merely another offshoot of centuries-old anti-feminism, but it's fundamentally a new phenomenon that was launched for the sake of establishing a nationalist neoconservative response." So, Leta, let's start with you. That was Andrea's view from her context. How do you understand what the anti-gender movement is and the connection between gender and authoritarianism in the countries where you live or research?
Well, thank you so much, Eliza, for that very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this journalism festival as well. I'm going to speak more to the situation in China, which is somewhat different because it's an autocratic country that does not have elections. But I will say that I have been very disappointed in how the reporting on China and autocracy in general treats gender and feminism as a completely irrelevant or at best marginal issue. But in all of the many years of research that I've done and the writing that I've done, I argue that actually the Chinese Communist Party sees the subjugation of women as absolutely essential to its authoritarian control of the entire population. And so this certainly echoes a lot of other global trends with anti-gender movements and the rise of the far right. In China specifically, I'll just give you one example of, the Me Too movement everybody is familiar with. In China's version of the Me Too movement, there was actually one Me Too feminist activist who was disappeared for 2 years. Nobody knew where she was. And just a few months ago, she was placed on trial on very vague charges of subversion. And it is so incredibly opaque, we still don't even know what the verdict is. But the anti-feminist persecution, the anti-feminist crackdown by the Chinese government is extremely intensive and broad. And it does go to the core of basically the dictatorship of Xi Jinping and the future and longevity of the Communist Party.
Thank you. Steph, please give us the perspective from Kenya and perhaps more broadly across East Africa.
Right. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. I think from a Kenyan perspective, and maybe let me give some contextual background, right? Kenya has one of the most progressive constitutions on the African continent and arguably around the world. And I say this for many reasons, but one of them is because it provides explicitly for the right to the highest attainable standard of reproductive health. The Constitution also speaks on safe abortion and access to abortion. And contrary to popular belief, abortion is not illegal in my country, it is only restricted. 14 years later, since we promulgated this very progressive constitution, our male-dominated parliament and very patriarchal parliament has failed to pass legislation that would give effect to this constitutional provision. So what we're seeing is very depressing statistics, right? So we rank third globally when it comes to teenage pregnancy rates. And 11 years ago, I contributed to this depressing statistic as a teenage mother myself. Today, on average, 738, I think, girls get pregnant every single day, and 40 of them are between the ages of 10 and 14. Despite this statistic, and despite the government giving their own statistics saying that the debut age for sex nationally is 15, the government has refused to provide comprehensive sexuality education. Sexual and reproductive health and rights continue to operate in a legislative vacuum, right? Issues such as IVF and assisted reproduction continue to operate in a legal and ethical vacuum, right? And so we see that we are in a reproductive health crisis, and yes, the government is taking a hard stance, but there are people behind the scenes who are pulling these strings, and this is what I call the opposition. This is the anti-gender, anti-rights movement. And the face of this movement in Kenya or in East Africa is Citizen Go and Family Watch International. So Citizen Go is based in Madrid. Family Watch International is US-based, right? And we see the influence, foreign influence on African sexuality politics. And they're really good on their narrative. And they talk about safe abortion being, a sin. Actually, they don't even recognize that there's safe abortion. Abortion is murder, according to the opposition. LGBTQI is foreign, which is very ironic because Citizen Go is headquartered in Madrid and Family Watch International in the US. And so this formed the basis for my podcast series, which is The New Cold War, looking at how the opposition is using propaganda and is using disinformation and misinformation and digital platforms as their playing field to kind of pull the strings and have a detrimental impact on sexual and reproductive health in Kenya and the region.
Wonderful. And lastly, Luciana, can you please lay out your stall setting, giving us a sense of the context in Argentina and LATAM?
Muchas gracias por la invitación, a Eliza especialmente. Y lo increíble es que las periodistas en Argentina estamos siendo castigadas no por lo que no logramos, sino por haber logrado el sueño de toda periodista, que es tener incidencia en la transformación social y especialmente llegar a una enorme cantidad de jóvenes que nos leyeron. Este libro se llama La Revolución de las Hijas y muestra la marea verde por el aborto legal que fue aprobado el 30 de diciembre del 2020 y que tuvo la participación de más de 1 millón de jóvenes en la calle.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eliza, for allowing me to be here. The journalists in Argentina are being disciplined, not for what didn't we achieve, but actually for what we did, for our social incidents and all the change we have created in the society. And this book is called The Revolution of Daughters, and it shows the movement in Argentina that approved the rights for abortion in 2020.
En la Argentina, el gobierno actual de extrema derecha, en un backlash extremo, acaba de desfinanciar el programa de prevención del embarazo adolescente, que logró reducir en un 60% el embarazo adolescente, amenaza con derogar el aborto y cerró el Ministerio de las Mujeres, Géneros y Diversidad. Argentina es un país pionero en las leyes de identidad de género, en el cupo laboral trans, en educación sexual, en reparto de anticonceptivos y también en la ley de aborto legal más progresiva del mundo. Hoy es un foco de la amenaza a las mujeres, a la diversidad sexual y a las periodistas que cubrimos género.
The current far-right government has managed to curtail the rights that Argentina has won over the years. For example, it shut down the Minister of Women and Gender in the country, and also cut off resources for sex education in the country. Argentina has been one of the countries in the forefront for rights and gender rights in the region, and that's why journalists are under attack now because of this.
Sorry. I wonder if we can stay with Luciana, because we should probably come very quickly to trying to understand motivations. When we had the pre-panel conversation, something that you said later was very interesting in how China used to be actually much more gender equal. And I'm curious, from each of your vantage points, what are the motivations that are, incentivizing politicians to use what Judith Butler would call, gender hysteria, a sort of festering, forming a fear of gender ideology, of gender theory. What does it serve political, gains to move gender into the political space in this way?
La alianza conservadora que tiene a Donald Trump en Estados Unidos, a Giorgia Meloni, que acaba de permitir que se pueda culpabilizar a las mujeres que van a abortar en Italia, a Santiago Abascal de Vox en España, entre otros líderes mundiales, busca aplastar al feminismo como movimiento político de liberación y de esperanza para un mundo mejor. Las periodistas que hemos sacado estos temas del closet, que hemos logrado tener impacto en las jóvenes, somos especialmente perseguidas por lo que esta extrema derecha llama la batalla cultural, en donde buscan que ya no podamos o escribir libros o estar en las ferias del libro o tener una llegada masiva con un impacto mundial en la cuarta ola feminista, que fue el fenómeno más esperanzador del siglo XXI, por supuesto, con los movimientos ambientales y antirracistas.
There is a connection between far-right governments in Argentina, but also connected to Trump in the US and other governments in the region. They're trying to criminalize women. And this is what they call the cultural war or the cultural battle in the region that is trying to also avoid journalists, like journalists writing or creating content, writing books, and they are being displays of these spaces because they don't want them to tell the story and to make the impact they are making with their work. And this is also based on, well, one of the main, the fourth wave of feminism in the region. And yeah, I think that's it.
Fue el fenómeno más esperanzador del siglo
Yeah,
XXI.
which the fourth wave of feminism in the region was the biggest hope for the region for feminism.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, from an African perspective and mostly from a Kenyan perspective, what I see as being the motivation is twofold. Yeah, so one is money. 95% of all the aid that comes to Kenya on health, on sexual and reproductive health and rights, comes from the US. Now, the US operates the Mexico City policy, commonly known as the global gag rule. And this is a ping pong game, really, that we're relegating our rights as women and as sexual and gender minorities to whoever is sitting in power in Washington, DC, right? So what this policy is, every time the Republicans are in place, they institute it, and every time the Democrats are there, they withdraw it. And so this oscillating nature, has an effect on sexual and reproductive health and rights. But going back to the issue of money is the, excuse me, the responsibility of sexual and reproductive health and rights sits with the government. However, they've relegated this responsibility to non-governmental organizations. And so for I guess maybe now my English is failing me, but one of the biggest motivations for the political class in terms of this issue is just on funding. And when we look at the opposition, they also have this group called the Political Network for Values, and you see presidents in there, and you see very high-level decision makers there, and they back each other up. When we look at it from a point of philanthropy and progressive philanthropy from the middle to the left, we don't want to touch anything on politics, but the opposition is going to actually give money to politicians to run their campaigns and to win elective office. So I think one is the money, two is patriarchy. Africa is largely a patriarchal society where women have been relegated to the periphery, and so you have men, and then you have the boys, the sons, and then after that you have women very close to property. So I would say those are the two motivations.
As for China, the People's Republic of China was founded on the basis of gender equality. And during the Communist Revolution leading up to 1949, in fact, gender equality or feminism was held up as a rallying cry and used to recruit a lot of women to this revolution. And in the early years of the communist era, in fact, China had probably the greatest or the highest female labor force participation rate in the world. The Communist Party really wanted all women to work, to delay marriage, in fact, so that they could continue working to build up the industrial output of this young communist nation. Now, with the onset of market reforms and the acceleration of economic growth, particularly in the 1990s and after 2000, and you had this so-called economic miracle in China, women in China were, or today, are more educated than ever before in Chinese history. And this is itself an indicator of the success of the Communist Party, in fact, in elevating this notion of gender equality. But today, the professional and educational achievements of women are regarded by the Communist Party as a threat rather than something to be celebrated. And so there are a lot of different things that have gone along with this resurgence of gender inequality, a lot of new gender discrimination, and the rise of a grassroots feminist movement that is independent of the state, of the Communist Party. Basically, in 2015, there was a turning point when the government jailed 5 feminist activists on the eve of International Women's Day. These women were just trying to celebrate International Women's Day by handing out stickers about sexual harassment on subways and buses. And the government decided, well, let's just get rid of this budding feminist movement because it's, it wasn't seen as a threat. Feminism was not regarded as a threat prior to that year. But subsequently, with the jailing of these women who became known as the Feminist Five, ironically, there was a huge backlash. There was a huge uproar among the feminist community, and what became a larger feminist movement actually was the result of the jailing. And so since then, there's been a very brutal anti-feminist crackdown. There's been intense surveillance and censorship of feminist discourse online. I mentioned the detention of this woman, Sophia Huang Xueqin, who has already been in detention for 2 years. But feminism itself is seen as something subversive. Now, the backdrop to that, which is very important, is the demographic background of continuously falling birth rates and marriage rates. And of course, it is tied to reproduction, which is certainly global. Reproductive rights are under threat in so many different countries. China used to have what was known as a one-child policy, but because of the falling birth rates, the government now wants to push women into very traditional roles of wife and mother in the home. And in fact, just a few months ago, Xi Jinping said for the first time at a high-profile women's conference that China needs to embrace a new marriage and child-rearing culture. So it's a particular kind of woman that, particularly under Xi Jinping, it's called the new era of Xi Jinping, and there's a new era woman who is very docile and traditional. She plays her correct subservient role within the family, and the family harmony or stability of the family, where the woman is in a very subservient role, is seen as critical to the stability of the nation, which is seen as this big patriarchal, big family of China.
This is all really fascinating, and I think the reason why it is important is really that, right? For us to be able to do our work, not just of describing in the moment what happens, but connecting the dots and being able to tell our audiences why it is happening so that we can be able to understand, which is what public interest journalism is, give citizens the information so that they can then make decisions based on that information. And understanding from all these different vantage points, what you're saying about motivation really should lead us as journalists to ask questions like, to what end? Who benefits? What is the sort of policy that is being developed over here, perhaps, that doesn't seem to have anything to do with gender and women's rights, but that has a direct consequence? A trivial, well, not trivial, a small and also dated example I will give is from maybe a Scandi country that shall remain nameless. Several years ago, its Women's Rights or International Development Ministry put out a statement about how it was going to be supplying many more contraceptives to various parts of the developing world. And then there was this additional line there about how it was going to be helpful in keeping birth rates down so that we don't have people who later come over to our countries. And so what ostensibly, what on the face of it looks like a pro-woman, pro-women's rights, pro-women's bodily autonomy policy is actually using women's bodies as the site of your immigration policy. And that if you don't see how these things connect, then the ways in which you report them might not enable audiences to reject the policy, which on the face of it might seem in support of women. I know we have, in Luciana's presence, a very sort of visceral example of the risks of doing some of this work, but I want to ask each of you again, what has been the impact of you covering this work or other people covering this work that you've seen? There are many panels here in Perugia about the safety of journalism and about how women journalists particularly, and also gender, diverse journalists are targets for vitriol and trolling online. But I wanted us to humanize it a little bit and to understand what your own experiences have been, whether positive or negative. Yes, please. No, if you start.
Well, I mean, I don't think I want to go into the details of my personal experiences. I think more important is to focus on the persecution of Chinese feminist activists. And I should say, actually, that Sophia Huang Xueqin, whose current status is, I mean, she's detained, she's been tried for subversion. We don't know how long she will remain in jail or detention, but she's a journalist, and in fact, she was detained and tried for subversion because she was documenting other female journalists in China who had been sexually harassed or raped. So that's just, this is directly related to the field of journalism, but it also is a feminist topic which is now seen as something that is a threat to the stability of the Communist Party and autocracy. But there are so many other women. There's also, by the way, a strong overlap with the LGBTQ plus community. There's also this, a particular kind of masculinity that is embraced. And so it's a very sweeping crackdown on civil society in general under Xi Jinping. But the feminist movement also has a lot of very savvy organizers who some of whom are really prepared to go to jail. There are others who are now in exile, others who have gone underground. But this feminist movement is, I would say, the most resilient and very complicated challenge to the Communist Party, in part because it also resonates with many, many millions of ordinary young women in China who are increasingly rebelling against marriage and childbirth. And this is one of the only ways, in fact, in the current climate in China that is so dangerous, that where women can actually take control of their lives and just by choosing to remain single. And some of these women see it as an act of political resistance.
Stephanie, what have been some of the impacts and responses that you've seen to your podcast?
Right. So I'll speak to my personal experience, but I'll also speak to others. So one of the tactics of the opposition is intimidation and fear. And they also use smear campaigns. And so a lot of and they're not very many, a lot of the legislators that are brave enough to advance these causes in parliament or on their platforms have been trolled online. They have been harassed. They've put up billboards, just harassing them. So this is one of the repercussions that we're seeing for people who are brave enough to speak out against the opposition. There's a rising wave of homophobia on the African continent. And this is in 4 countries. So we have Ghana, we have Kenya, we have Uganda, and very recently now Congo has joined this group of 4. And just allow me so that I get it right. In Ghana, there is the bill that just passed, which is called the Protection of Proper Human Sexual Rights and Ghanaian Family Values. And it criminalizes homosexuality, including arrests, right, jail time, but also forced corrective surgery for trans people or intersex people. In Kenya, there's the Family Protection Bill that was introduced, and it's ironic because the sponsor of this bill is a deadbeat who is always in court because of child support. So it's ironic that he then sponsors a bill called Family Protection, and his name is Peter Kaluma. And, it's very similar to what we're seeing in Ghana. In Uganda, they passed it. It is now the law. And there's a crime called aggravated homosexuality, and some of the repercussions of this include the death penalty. And so you have people who are LGBTIQ+, you have people who are working to support that work, allies, who are then at risk of arrest and even death, right? And Congo has now joined that. And it's not by accident. It's very concerted, it's coordinated, it's very cut and paste. So what we're seeing in Ghana is exactly what we're seeing in the rest of, this other countries. But the other threat that I see is not from a personal perspective, not the human cost, but the economic cost of it, right? So when you have a lot of or you have this rising and increasingly bold and visible opposition that is working against you, then you have to really use resources to counter that. Now we are in a poly-crisis, we have conflict, we just got out of COVID, right? We have climate change, and we're pulling from a a basket that is really dwindling in terms of philanthropy and money, and so then that exposes people to other issues, including access to health and access to HIV treatment and so on and so forth. So those are, the threats I would talk about. Personally, I had an experience where my phone was stolen, and it happens, right? You lose your phone. But 3 days later, my phone was returned, and I was like, interesting. Who steals a phone and returns the phone? And it got me thinking. And so, there's a possibility that they mined my data, and there's a possibility that they uploaded spyware. And this is the real threat that people working around these issues are facing. I have also gotten, I went on radio one day and I was talking about the East African Sexual Reproductive Health Bill. And, this was a maybe 20-kilometer drive from the station to my house. And when I got a hold of my phone, it was filled with, am I allowed to say this? Dick pics. And you have rape threats. And this is a very, it's very common for people working around this area to receive such things. And so one of the things that we're doing, and I'm doing, is I'm working very closely with my woman representative in the National Assembly, Honorable Esther Passaris, and a Senator, Honorable Senator Muma, to to introduce online sexual violence as a crime in the Republic.
Thank you. I think before we come to Luciana, what was really, at least the thing that I'm taking away at the end of that, is that we tend to think about protecting journalists who, maybe go into conflict areas or who report on things that we might more readily imagine as risky, but as actually covering gender inequality in certain contexts is dangerous work. And so, gender journalists are often isolated and are doing that work without great resource, and actually very often without support in newsrooms because it's not seen as essential or reporting. And so this is why, this conversation is just really a fantastic reminder for me about the risks that people take to do the work. Luciana, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the impact has been for you, and then we'll see if we can take any questions from the floor.
El impacto es muy, pero muy fuerte porque después de 25 años de ser periodista de temas de género, me tuve que ir de mi país 10 días después de la asunción de Javier Milei en Argentina y pedir asilo en España.
Well, it has been a big impact in her work and in her life. Since 25 years, she has been working as a feminist journalist, and she had to leave Argentina after 10 days since the government of Javier Milei won the presidency.
Es importante que las amenazas sobre mí y mi trabajo no empezaron cuando llegó la extrema derecha al poder, sino que la extrema derecha llegó al poder por haber ejercido violencia sobre las voces de mujeres con impacto público, entre otras razones económicas y políticas. Pero sí, la violencia empieza en el momento de mayor auge del feminismo y de mi trabajo en particular como blanco de lo que ellos llaman la batalla cultural.
The attacks against her didn't start when the far right started governing the country, but it was more before that because they were targeting especially women working on the field. And can you repeat?
Que llegaron al poder por ejercer violencia contra las mujeres y no empezó la violencia cuando llegaron al poder.
Ya, eso lo dije.
A ver, sigo aquí. En la justicia está probado en una sentencia judicial que hubo una orquestación organizada para amedrentarme y para amenazarme, que pusieron en Instagram: te mereces ser la próxima, ante un posteo de una nota periodística sobre femicidio.
Yeah, it is proved in the country that it was coordinated and orchestrated by the government, threats by the government against her, and even on a post, it was posted on a note, on an article that she wrote about femicide. You deserve to be the next.
Está probado que la persona que dijo que merecía ser víctima de femicidio lo hizo desde un teléfono sacado a nombre de Thelma Fardín, que es una actriz víctima de violencia sexual que denunció ante la justicia y que es el caso del Me Too argentino que yo escribí y llevé adelante. O sea, me amenazaban a mí con un teléfono sacado falsamente en nombre de la víctima a la que yo escribí su historia.
Yeah, it's proof that she received this threat or this comment came in this post on Instagram came from a phone that was under the name of Thelma Bardin. That is one of the victims of the Me Too, how the Me Too movement started in Argentina, and she helped actually this victim to demand and to denounce this, to speak out about this case.
Ese teléfono tenía dirección en el edificio de la Fuerza Aérea Argentina, una fuerza aérea que en la dictadura llegó a tirar a personas desaparecidas vivas al río de la Plata, o sea que es perteneciente a un ex integrante de fuerzas militares en Argentina, y también sacaron teléfonos a mi nombre. Esto muestra no solo la vulnerabilidad de las periodistas argentinas, sino que hoy Meta está permitiendo ataques a periodistas que en algunos casos se pueden identificar y que con redes transnacionales, si no hay una ley global, pueden decir esto pertenece a otra jurisdicción y que quede impune.
This phone belonged to one of the air forces in Argentina, people that threw Argentinians to the river in the country, like kill people basically in the country, and they like other ways of attack she received was also they put phones under her name, which was not true, and also she's saying Meta is allowing this to happen, and this could totally be corrected, but there is no interest.
Okay, we don't have very much time, but I think it would be a missed opportunity to not see if there are any questions from the floor. We'll just probably take, 2, 3, however many that we have in one go, and then the speakers can answer whichever calls to them. That is presuming there are any questions from the floor. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, please raise your hand so that we can see you. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. This is such a great panel. In some places, women's rights have been pitted against the rights of gender minorities, and I'm thinking particularly here in Britain of, women and trans women. How do we then build a more effective coalition that includes everybody in all of this?
I think that's a wonderful question. Are there any others? There's one behind you.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing panel. I was just wondering, was it again a conscious decision to do an all-female panel on this topic? And again, we're so many more women in this room than in other sessions. And any word on that? I know this is a repeat thing, but if you have any thoughts on that, thank you.
There was a laugh that sounded almost like a heckle then. And final question, thank you.
Thank you. What are some of the biggest traps that you see journalists fall into when covering this topic in your country context? And also, when you observe the media coverage, are there any gaps that you think are really big and missing from the coverage?
Fantastic. Okay, let's end there. There are, perhaps the question that was to me, I'll answer it in a second. There are, even amongst people who self-identify as women, not very many journalists who cover the overlap of gender and authoritarianism, anti-gender movements, punto, like, full stop, let alone men who report on these issues. So it was a challenge to be able to find people whose work is specifically at the intersection of gender and authoritarianism and far-right movements, and that was the focus of the conversation. Are men welcome in it? Absolutely. So when they make it their beat too, hopefully we're here next year and can have a bloke on. Okay, fantastic. Right, panelists, between the two questions that we've had, one was about sort of like the siloing and the need to bring it together, and the other, really a fantastic question to end with. Take whichever one, and then we will close. Let's start with you, Luciana.
Yo creo que hay que jerarquizar los temas de género en la agenda periodística mundial. Creo que hay pocos varones en esta sala porque todavía hay mucho machismo y porque además, aunque crean los varones que están tratando temas más importantes, tienen mucha ignorancia sobre la importancia geopolítica de los temas de género hoy en el mundo. Una de las razones por las que creo que hay pocos varones también es porque el movimiento feminista no solo es un movimiento social, sino que también ha producido una interpelación sobre los modos de producción en las noticias, en los canales de televisión y en las redacciones. Por eso creo que el periodismo de género tiene que tener apoyo especial, porque si no, los varones van a seguir siendo los protagonistas y no van a aceptar la interpelación del modo de producción de las noticias.
Yeah, well, there are not many men in this room, and I believe that is happening because there is still a lot of this macho culture. And I believe there is also a lot of ignorance about men have this ignorance about why is so important gender in geopolitics and in the world, and why is so important geopolitics and gender in the world, and that's why they are not here. Gender journalism needs special support because otherwise men are gonna keep controlling the narrative without understanding the dynamics of the news productions.
Thank you, Luciana, and thank you so much, Gabriela, for the fantastic work you've done of translating. All right, unless we want to be dragged kicking and screaming, you each have a minute.
Okay, very quickly, I think on the question on traps is around the messaging, right? Family values, African values, this is what the opposition uses. It's a big deal in Africa just because of the communal way in which we live, Ubuntu, Harambee, which are philosophies from South Africa and Kenya. So let's not get trapped, and let's try to understand that when we see certain words, this is coming from the far right. But to your question around women's rights, so how do we build coalitions, right, and bring in more people? One is, I think I just want to make it very clear that just because somebody is working on women's rights doesn't make them feminist, right? We can't even agree as to what feminism is as a movement, right? As human rights defenders or activists, we cherry pick and we say, I'm a human rights lawyer, for example, or I'm a human rights defender, but I draw the line at safe abortion, or I draw the line at LGBTQ. So it's going to be very difficult to kind of bring in a critical mass that agrees on policy consistency. And so from my perspective, even if you look at what's happening in the Gambia with FGM, so from what I see is, can we try and weave in these issues with other developmental issues, and that way we build critical mass with more, multisexual partners, is what I would say. Thank you. Yeah.
I guess starting with the question about women's rights versus other, like, trans rights. I mean, trans women are women, so, women's rights means trans rights. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, actually. And so I think that with regard to China, in fact, the feminist movement is very embracing of trans rights. A lot of the feminist activists themselves are, in fact, a huge number of them are queer or identify as non-binary. And so, yeah, I think it is important to be all embracing and all inclusive. With regard to just the gaps in coverage, I think I alluded to the fact that I was very disappointed in the fact that so many journalists are reporting on China and autocracy and authoritarianism. The rise of fascism globally is also seen as something that is separate from women's rights, separate from gender, but it's not at all. I mean, they're inextricably connected. I might notice that there are quite a few panels about the rise of fascism, and I'm sure there are plenty of men attending those sessions. But the fact that there are so few men here, you know, just illustrates the fact that so many, the majority news organizations tend to still be dominated and run by men, and even sometimes there are women who are in charge, but of course the entire culture is extraordinarily patriarchal and very heteronormative. So of course it's mostly women here. Yes, I certainly don't think that it should be seen as a weakness at all that there are, you know, 5 women on our panel. I mean, why should we? Well, why should we go out of our way to include men or maybe trans men? But yeah, but I mean, this is, you know, I write about patriarchal authoritarianism. Authoritarianism itself is patriarchal, is misogynistic, and in order to fight the rise of fascism globally, you have to fight misogyny and sexism.
Big round of applause, please. Thank you. Nothing else to add. Thank you so much for coming. Please buy our panelists a drink at the bar, and you can pick their brains more then. Have a good afternoon.